Evan, what do you think the nature of consciousness is?
The nature of consciousness. It's always important to repeat the question, right? Subjective storytelling. I guess I'm gonna plant a flag there just to start. And I know those are just two words, but I think in some way I just have to like get something out and then to start unpacking. But that's kind of where my mind goes right away. Subjective storytelling. Because feed me a little more. Feed me a little more. Give me a little bit more of a framework. What angle, what side do we want to come in on this with?
I enjoyed your reply.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I could just continue to unravel that, and then you can.
Yeah. Let's
step
unpack subjective storytelling.
in.
I like that. Let's unpack. Cool.
Yeah. Well, so consciousness, I think it's a very personal thing on the one sense, which obviously we both know we've talked about this off the record many times, and there is a universal aspect to it, but there's also a highly personal aspect to it, and for whatever reason, the personal, to me, is what immediately comes to the fore. Whether that's right, wrong, left, right, up, down, personal is where I first go with it. Because I think, in some sense, the easiest way to understand, I guess, consciousness as a concept is to kind of think about this notion of there we're each, with the risk of sounding too self-involved and too narcissistic, we're all the star of our own movies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there is a cinematic aspect to your subjective experience of life, right? Like
Yes.
I mean, even down to the way that I think we typify and characterize experiencing life. It's primarily through the visual in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like we were talking about earlier, this idea of, what, if you had to deprive yourself of one of the senses, which would be which would be the prime one? And I think the visual is the prime one because it's what allows you as a conscious operator to track your movement through space and time, right?
The prime one you'd want to keep, and then the prime one you were saying that you'd want to remove if forced was olfactory smell, was the one that you guys indicated earlier in your conversation. I like subjective storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
I think subjective storytelling has a feel to me that it's accommodating, was the first sort of adjective that came to mind. It's accommodating.
That's right.
Subjective storytelling is accommodating. And then I also appreciated how you gave us the spectrum right off the bat, because you gave the super individual and you also gave the universal.
Yeah.
And so there's this spectrum too. Now, I think another interesting thing for us to talk about is, I think maybe like all 8 billion people are familiar with the individual consciousness. Yeah. I think that's pretty fair to say.
You've
like
known
all
it since
8 billion.
birth. Yeah.
No, all 8 billion people, familiar with.
Maybe.
Yeah, but familiar with it at, I would say, a surface level.
Yeah.
Like the peak of the iceberg is conscious awareness that is almost involved with something outside of itself. Like it's kind of constantly interacting with the objective world versus this being the subjective, right? So it would be,
that kind of squares with
let me hit this for a second longer, because I think this is interesting to give us a runway on.
Yeah, please.
So subjective storytelling, okay, and then we have this sort of like objective outside, and we were talking about a lot of people don't even go into the relationship between the two, the subject and the object. We don't even do that, or the subject and the subject and the space between this. So there's that. And then the peak in this case of the iceberg would be something like one that knows that they're conscious and aware, but that they focus a vast majority, if not all of their time, on the objective outside. And then what's below the 90% of iceberg below that peak that's above the water is something along the lines of the deeper analysis of what exists beyond the subject spending vast majority, if not all time, on object outside. So it would be like if they spent more time on investigating the subject itself. So there's consciousness investigating itself as kind of one thing on the iceberg. And then another thing would be that consciousness investigating its relationship to other individual consciousness.
I see what you're saying.
And consciousness investigating its relationship with object. So, but it's relationship, not just object.
Okay,
right?
I see what you're saying.
Okay, and most
That's
people,
complex.
yeah. So we're unpacking the iceberg here, and so most people take the device, and they engage with the device in a way that is, actually, this could be interesting. When most people, let's say, engage with the device, let's go to Spotify. So what I would say is occurring on the device is the demo itself is, let's see what is better than that, because I don't really want to get into social. Let's give, my point is I'll just give you the most macro level on it. The device itself is where the person engages with, and now there's only a couple billion people on the planet that engage with the device on a 8-hour per day basis type thing. A lot of people don't have the laptops, computers, cell phones type thing, smartphones. But for those that do, what's occurring for vast majority of people, from what I've understood, is that the subject engages with the object like it's an object, that the subject is only engaging with the object and focusing their consciousness on just the object, rather than the subject realizing that it's them, their relationship with the object that they can investigate in the iceberg. Anyway, we kind of gave a couple things: consciousness investigating itself, consciousness investigating with other consciousness, consciousness investigating its relationship to objects, all in the iceberg of subjective storytelling and understanding what the nature of it is, what the nature of awareness is. So there's this big peak iceberg of mostly subject immersed fully in object without investigating its relationship to it, or its relationship to what consciousness is, or its relationship to other consciousness. I would say that would be kind of one of the first sort of hit backs that I would do of the tennis ball to that.
Right, just kind of parsing out what are the different, almost archetypical or typological A to B interactions between, it's kind of subject-object in a way.
And subject too.
Yeah.
It's like subject investigating itself is one that really, okay, let's do another one quick. Most people are most familiar with subject investigating its relationship with object.
Definitely.
Okay, so if we were to go one level up from just subject being immersed in object and never investigating its relationship to object, that the first one would be subject realizing it has a relationship to object and then it investigating that. Okay, that would be like the first. That would be like, for example, the social dilemma. It would be like it would be like the person finally waking up to the fact that their relationship with the device is more deep than just it being an object. Yeah. Okay, there you go.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean,
that's one level up, and we'll go to the other levels.
Almost they're levels of enlightenment in a way, right? Or you could use awareness. it's a more sophisticated. It's a heightening of the sophistication level of the awareness. Is to me what you're saying, right?
Beautiful hit back.
Yeah.
So my argument would be that in doing the process of which we are describing, one becomes much more attuned to the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality and the nature of other conscious agents and the nature of the holism, the nature of the whole. And so in doing so, one becomes more enlightened, one becomes more aware, one becomes more conscious as a being, and therefore everything that one does becomes more moral, more ethical, more spiritually awake and aware. Therefore, one does not cast malevolence, one does not cast evil, one does not self-deal and take advantage of other people purposely. One begins behaving in a way that butterfly affects out the highest possible states. So that's why this is so important beyond just what appears to be the tip of the iceberg is very enthralling, and it's captivating, and it's almost like obsessively compulsively captivating. Like, I have to do my best basically on a moment to moment basis of my life to draw myself away from the enthralling relationship that we have on a strictly subject immersed in object and never trying to understand the relationship or the subject investigating itself or subject with other subject.
Yeah.
So if this is first, one could say that one takes the first step into the bottom of the iceberg, towards the bottom of the iceberg, by that social dilemma analogy. Let's keep using that one. It's a good one.
I also think, in a way, being able to even recognize and codify that first step, if you can even be aware that first step exists and that you're in that stage, that's actually kind of step 1.5 to getting to number 2, right?
That's good.
Because in some ways what you're describing is self-awareness, right? It's if you can even conceptualize these, what was it, 4 different levels or
something like that. We're going to figure out where we're
if you
going
can even
with this,
conceptualize those abstractly, even if you haven't really played them out yet or really manifested them in the way you're thinking, like if you can even conceptualize that those exist, you've already transcended step 1.
Yes.
Because there's a level of self-awareness there, right?
Yes, which is kind of like the autopilot, egoic consciousness, one could
that's
say.
a great way to put it.
Yeah. Okay. So something important to remember is that the Delphic maxim that was written on the Temple of Apollo about 2,500 years ago was know thyself. And the other 2 Delphic maxims that are known as the most salient are nothing in excess and surety brings ruin.
Surety brings ruin.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Exactly. So it's like a dose of hubris, right? Yep. A dose of humility. A dose of humility to counter hubris. That's a better way to put it. And then nothing in excess. So those are the 3. But then know thyself. The question would be, why is know thyself not only written on the front of the Temple of Apollo as the number 1 Delphic maxim, but why is it the thing that almost all of the ancient perennial spiritual traditions point to or talk about? And
the know thyself.
The know thyself. Aspect. And what now the next question is, what is self? Right? You said self-awareness, right? A lot of people, it's very interesting to me because a lot of people that I know that went to the process of the most common path that people walk down. So in like Robert Frost, they took the path that most people walk down, not the one that other people weren't. Okay. The people that do that are typically the people that tell me about self-awareness. And it's funny because because I ask them, I'm like, what does self-awareness mean to you? And that's when things become kind of interesting, because it's almost like when you only understand self-awareness from the perspective of psychology, but you don't understand self-awareness from the perspective of spirituality. And so, and there's, I don't want to like mutually exclusively separate them, because they're not, but you can kind of tell when someone is like that, because typically what they'll do is they'll say self-awareness, but they'll use that to
as an escape, or almost, it's a crude word, but excuse is almost the word I want to say. So what came to mind when you said the self-awareness from a spiritual versus psychological was, to me, I think self-awareness on a spiritual level is awareness that how you do or don't align with the kind of spiritual ideal, meaning the God figure. How do you diverge or converge with the features of that God figure, right? That's awareness of, because that's the ideal self. Because we all, in a best case scenario, we all would embody the characteristics of godliness, right? By whatever you dress it in, perhaps is not as important, but
that's beautiful. I want to also take us to remember what you said. You gave us, right when you broke down into subjective storytelling, you broke it down into the individual and the universal. Sure. Okay. So this is where I think it'll be good to take this, because I think what people that say the word self-awareness from a psychological perspective, they mean the individual. Yeah. They mean the individual, and they have only studied self from an individual perspective. So it basically again, I don't want to be mutually exclusive, because it's not, but I just want to say, like, usually people that basically took the most common path, which is whether it be somebody that went through the normal academic structure of studying psychology, or whether it be somebody that like enjoyed because they became a business person and then they wanted to know more about psychology, and then they understood what self-awareness was, and actually in the high level perception we could potentially talk about the individual side as the North Star side. So that to a certain extent the North Star is really what people mean when they say self-awareness, is they mean from a psychological perspective or an individual perspective would be something like, how aware are you of your consciousness and your moment-to-moment awareness and your North Star? So your dreams, your goals, your aspirations. How aware are you of your roots and your fruits, right? Your roots is where you have, roots and fruits is one of my favorite. It's you guys will see that when I break down high level perception in more detail with my stack of notes over there on camera and stuff. But so how aware are you of your roots, where you have your lineage, you have if you got love when you were young, if you got water, food, shelter, the basic needs being met. How aware are you of your traumas, your parents' traumas, this type of stuff? Okay. So there's the roots, and then there's the fruits, which is how aware are you, there's also the moment to moment. How aware are you of your moment to moment beingness? And then how aware are you of your fruits? So how aware are you of your North Star? Yeah. So I'm just saying it's very individual, right? Now, where I think the spiritual or the universal, like you said, come into play, which many people that have went down the normal path have never touched and don't understand, is it's when you become more porous. In chapter 9, in high level perception, we talk about identity and we talk about porosity. And so it's basically the evolution of consciousness away evolving beyond transcending and including, as Ken Wilber and Claire Graves and Don Beck and Chris Cowan, Spiral Dynamics and whatnot have said, is that you go from egoic consciousness to social consciousness to ethno-consciousness to worldly consciousness to transpersonal. So now, okay, and then non-dual and symphonic we can talk about, but I just want to say this before we do, is that what porosity means is that you become more and more aware of the universal. You become more and more aware of the depths of the iceberg that are not just the subject's relationship to an object. And so this is kind of what we're trying to unpack, because every time you've noticed, it's funny, we've spent a week together in LA, as Evan has been instrumental in the foundation of the transition of the simulation recording studio to Los Angeles. And Evan and I have spent some time also with not only talking about consciousness and the nature of reality ourselves, but also with other people. And every time that I've surgically, skillfully tried to insert consciousness or metaphysics into a group of people in discussion, it is it may be one of the most difficult things to do, because people have a proclivity to want to keep consciousness veiled from its own nature. Right? So it's like the veil of consciousness investigating itself is very strong. And so that's why when somebody inserts a question of how deeply have you investigated your source, or how deeply have you investigated your consciousness, these types of questions, the first thing that people do is typically, especially egoic level or social or ethno level consciousness, will typically do things like crack a joke, brush you off, and get back to its relationship with objects right away.
Right.
That's the proclivity. There's a very strong tendency for so.
Well, I think because it's one of those things where perhaps if I'm understanding it in one sense of the way you're describing it, it could be something that by definition would uncover flaws in the individual or aspects in which they fall short of, I guess, this universal consciousness. To me, I kind of still keep characterizing in my head as, right, how, if you were to overlay yourself and your traits with the traits of like the most godly figures in history, like where do they align or misalign? And that kind of that overlay and the cracks and the misalignments, most people are not too excited to see those, right? It's not necessarily a comforting thing. It pushes back on the ego, right? It pushes back on the lower roots. Lower roots.
Yeah, this is so beautiful. So you're spot on bringing this back up. So the universal is not only the relationship with the highest possible moral, ethical, spiritual states of existence, and that catalyzing the individual to actively strive towards that and sort of investigate its own roots that way, and its moment-to-moment being and its fruits, North Star, that way. But I would say that also on the universal exists the may I pull that? Yes, thank you. We have some of our images handy. Once you get that ready, I'll pull it up for you guys. Okay, beautiful. So what I want to show you is
just watch out for that A key. It's a doozy.
Oh, the A key. Okay.
It's a doozy.
All right. So here's what I'm going to show you guys. And you guys probably remember this, for those that have investigated. So, all right. Now, what we're looking at right now is we're looking at high-level perception the visual synthesis that I authored and published 2 weeks ago. This is chapter 9. It's on consciousness. And this is what I would say is a little bit closer in the direction of the universal. So if we begin unpacking this, this is what you could say exists in the iceberg at the lower levels, and that consciousness actively participates in trying to veil itself from this reality.
Sure.
Okay. So, and this is a very uncomfortable reality for people, and also a lot of people are starting to tap into this reality. And I'll explain how, because it's actually very interesting, because a lot of people are tapping into this reality by empathy, as we've talked about a lot.
That's right.
We've talked about that a lot. And
that's right.
It's super interesting because you basically get like an evolution of consciousness that occurs where people sort of rank themselves up and become more aware and more, especially more aware of the subject's relationship to other subjects and like the subject's kind of first person experience, that kind of thing.
Yes, that
but
part.
It's super interesting because people will get to that level of awareness, and it's super cool, but they stop there. Okay, so I'll give you an example. So basically somewhere around like 2000 and maybe like 14 or something like that, let's say, somewhere around 6 years ago or so, I was maybe 22. And what happened was I remember vividly learning my first time in my life that there are people that still carry a jerry can gallon on top of their head.
Yeah.
And they have to walk kilometers or miles to get water, fresh water, and bring it back to themselves, right? So this was kind of, I would say, my first like real introduction to kind of trying to truly get behind the first person subjective storytelling perspective of another. And so,
well, and that is all right if I butt in a bit.
Go ahead, yeah.
And that's interesting that you use that example too, because though in the one sense that is a subject to subject, it also is true that you've that is a kind of not an archetypical experience, but it is an experience that's shared with a large number of people.
That's
that particular instance you're saying.
Yes.
So it's individual to individual empathy, but it's also individual to population empathy. That's by nature, that being a universal behavior.
That's super interesting. So
because I think when people a lot of the times when people say empathy, I think it very much is that, like, you must be sitting across from somebody. It's like seeing a look in their eye or a tone in their voice that makes you kind of throws you ajar and makes you kind of instantly in that moment aware of something that's on their mind. But the level that you're talking about is kind of one step more abstracted from that, right?
Yeah, and I think there have been a lot of great minds that have talked about how when you say something like one person is hurting, somebody is much more very receptive and willing willing to help. But when you say that there are a million people hurting, the person's like, I can't do anything. What can I do about that type situation?
It's the scale and its abstractness of it.
Okay, exactly. So there's that, and then I think another interesting thing that you just mentioned is that you have, not only is it, like you said, a common like archetypal example of I think it's common for people to experience their first sort of doses into trying to immerse themselves in other people's more less fortunate subjective storytelling. In the case of if we're talking the approximately 800 million or so people on the planet that still don't have access to a clean source of water.
There's such an immediacy to that, right?
Yeah. There's a huge immediacy, and that's one of the main roots on the human in high level perception that we drew is the water. Water is one of the main things for the roots, just like it is for the tree. It's the same thing for the human.
And this is kind of Maslow's hierarchy in a way, right?
In a way, yes.
Kind of is that.
Yes. And so,
Yeah.
and so, so not only is it common for someone to have not only is it 800 approximately million people, and so the extension is to a large group of people that have to undergo some sort of similar process in their water procuration. Also, it's a common thing because it's not like I had a one-time experience with Evan that triggered because that's a more unique thing, but my experience wasn't that unique because there are dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of people on the planet that have had experiences like that have triggered them into so now we're talking into interesting territory. So what I think is what you're seeing now is I think it's the first sort of taste of what happens when one nerve ending, if you will, of the brain begins to investigate what it is like to be another nerve ending of the brain.
Sure.
In essence. Okay? So, without jumping to level 65, which would be something along the lines of try and hold all 8 billion people's perspectives at the same time, because then maybe that would be a higher level of consciousness than just trying to hold one person's perspective at the same time, right? So that's the first taste is when one nerve ending tries to go to another nerve ending and tries to understand his first person's perspective. Go ahead.
So that's an interesting idea. One thought with that too is, I think, to make it really tangible, I think another angle at which you can think about this is to consider what I would term, essentially the emotional valence of those two models of kind of empathizing, if you will, or understanding someone's experience. Because I would venture to say, generally speaking, highly individualized experiences around empathy or seeing the suffering of another almost always have a much more intense and lasting emotional valence than I think the more you abstract it and the more people that you're in theory empathizing the universal experience of them, the less kind of emotional pull it has for you, and the less it affects your behavior.
Interesting, because I could also
what I mean?
I could also make a massive argument against that.
So interesting.
So because here's the thing. The emotional valence that occurs when one really truly gets behind the problem of 800 million people not having access to clean water is significantly more emotional valence, in my opinion, than when one person is communicating to another person some sort of deep. In this case, it would be if one person was telling me that they came from a rural village around the world where they had to carry a jerry can on their head. So I'm just saying this. Sometimes someone's consciousness can't actually go right away. It kind of levels up slowly in a sense. Almost everyone's does this way. Not everybody gets immediate kind of states of leveling up several times. But in the example where it would be some sitting down with somebody and having them explain to me about their life, about them carrying a jerry can to get water, what would happen is it would usually trigger an evolution, a really nice sort of new baseline where I understand how that's existing in the world. But it doesn't go to the next step sometimes, which is I wonder how many people experience that. And so the next step is when you go, okay, how many people experience that? And then you realize that it's 800 million people experiencing that. And then the next step is when you try and hold 800 million people, subjective nerve endings on the planet, having a lack of clean water on a normal basis. And then sort of the next step after you hold the space for that is to say, what can I do entrepreneurially, artistically, scientifically, in order for me to help those 800 million people get clean water just like we have on tap in modernity, and we have no issue, we spend 0% of our daily thinking on an existence on procuring water. And what would that unleash? That's always the biggest question, is what would it unleash? How many beautiful fruits would it catalyze of people's North Stars and gifts and ability to not think primally in search for water, this type of stuff. So I think that there's sort of levels to becoming more and more aware of what exists in the bottom of the iceberg.
Yeah.
And what we just went through as an example of clean water, and truly holding, I guess we can use this word, but in today's sort of very woke culture, what occurs is a lot of people go to the one-on-one empathy,
hand-to-hand combat.
And then the question that I would ask is, what does it take for the consciousness to go to the next levels beyond that? And yeah.
Well, what I find really interesting about this, and I think perhaps we're on the precipice of where sometimes we end up with this, is what I hear you saying I agree with, in a world in which we are seeking the most ideal version of how a human brain could operate, or how humans could operate, which best case scenarios can play out. If there's, we've seen it happen in the world, right? We've set our course towards some sort of progress and we've been able to achieve it. But something worth considering is, I think I always end up taking the position of the kind of like biological materialist. And on this one, that's why I brought up the emotional valence thing specifically. So we were talking earlier off the camera about, I brought up this idea that people only usually take massive action if it has a really, really strong emotional valence. Like it's no coincidence that activists for sexual assault usually were sexually assaulted, right? Like, there's so many terrible things in the world. Your average person isn't going to wake up tomorrow and arbitrarily pick one and become that level passionate to defending and eradicating it unless they had a very personal experience with it, or somebody very close to them and they felt the emotional trauma. And I would make the case that the reason that is, and I would say that this kind of is somewhat biologically determinate, because if you look at how we used to live, generally speaking, you would rarely live in a society where your tribe was more than, I believe, 100 and 150 people, right? Mm-hmm. That was kind of that magic number, Dunbar's number. So I think that directly correlates with that idea that there's probably a biological evolutionary reason why there's this kind of emotional valence, and we struggle to have abstract notions of empathy or abstract notions of suffering. They seem to tend to not drive massive action in the same way, like these really hard-hitting personal, or your mother, your father, your son, your daughter, these people that are really close to you. Just because I think the human brain, at the end of the day, even if you think about how the brain, I think, structurally works, I think if you look at Phineas, the gentleman that got the railroad stake through his head, right? Mm-hmm. Like have you heard about this gentleman? So he maintained all his cognitive, intellectual capacities. Like, he could probably, he could navigate logical problems, but he struggled to, if I remember is correct, he struggled to put his efforts in a goal-directed way behind anything, because the part of his brain that was tied to emotion had been damaged or severed from the logical part. And because you need that emotional engine to trigger the abstract, start up and trigger the abstract logical part of the brain, that thing had been severed in him. So it wasn't like he lost intellectual capability or intelligence, he just lost motivation. And that, in my mind, that's kind of a case study in that notion that's why this kind of subjective low version is so potent, because it actually has to do with the brain structure and, in a biological material sense, right? Not to say that, perhaps there is a way that we...
May we try
Go
and
ahead.
hold?
Go ahead.
May we
Yeah.
try and hold space for the universal a little bit more?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
I think I said my thing. Go ahead.
What
Yeah.
typically occurs when attempting to investigate the nature of consciousness, and especially consciousness investigating itself, right? That part of the iceberg specifically, again, let's just go back through this because I think it's so important. Otherwise, we can get, what's really nice is like, let's specifically get a couple like layers of this. Let's specifically get a couple layers of this even on our visual system via the beautiful technology we have on our over the shoulder shot. So I'll do my best to sort of keep this in a good vision for you guys. So let's begin with our iceberg. So we have this. We'll go here. So we have this kind of like. Okay. All right. Is that seen well? Yeah, that's seen well enough. Cool. Okay. Great. So we have this iceberg. Now, this is kind of your classic iceberg example where you have approximately 10% of the iceberg that is above, and you have approximately 90% that is below. This is a very, very frequent analogy and metaphor used a lot in life. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to sort of illustrate to people where we were unpacking the majority of the nature of consciousness, and potentially that 10% of the top 10% of the iceberg is what a vast majority of consciousness is currently doing. So that means, if we go back here, that the vast majority of consciousness is doing something like kind of like subject immersed in object. And then we could say that it is, we'll go a step further and we'll sort of put a box around the object. It's almost as though like the subject's focus is extremely oriented on the object, and that's the vast majority of people's conscious aware experience on a moment-to-moment basis. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So now some of the other states that we were describing is when this might be closer to like here. This is like subject becomes aware of its relationship. So subject subject becomes aware of its relationship to object. So here, the subject's becoming more aware of the arrow portion. Okay?
It's a good diagram. It's clear.
Okay, cool. especially coming from someone that's a designer and architect. It's super duper important.
Yep.
Yeah.
You hit all the points.
Yeah.
The least number of elements to most simply show the idea.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
good.
exactly. That's the whole thing of high level
The
perception.
diagrams, yeah.
Also, yeah. That's the
right.
whole point of this component to simulation, to the show, is to begin trying to compress.
Memify almost. Yeah.
Memify.
Yeah.
We are attempting to become mimetic gods on the
Right.
program.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. That's what we are trying to do. And the more that we can compress the most profound wisdoms into the most distilled forms of art dissemination, the more we awaken and win.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
And not to go down a rabbit hole, and I think this is right on the right track, but to communicate things in a way, complex things in a way that they don't become complicated, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That kind of distinction.
Yes. And also just a distinction also that win does not mean like simulation winning. No. It's more like win meaning on a whole level. Remember holism?
I thought you meant like Charlie Sheen winning.
Yeah,
no?
yeah.
Oh.
On a
I was
whole,
excited.
Yeah, we got to get Charlie Sheen on the program too. We got a lot of people in LA we got to sit down with.
That's right. Perhaps he's enlightened now.
Yeah,
He could be.
We have a lot of work to do here. I'm so pumped though. The journey, love the journey, baby. So what happens is that when one can understand on a holism level the winning being of the entirety and not of some sort of like the individual can win in a Nash equilibrium at the same time as the collective can win. That's not a problem. We can have that conversation, no problem. But I mean the collective winning on a metaphysical level, like meaning in diagram number 10, in chapter 10 on infinity, in the second diagram, I give the Ouroboros and I give all of the Fermi filters, which are things like asteroids and mutually assured destruction with nuclear bombs and the planetary health bar being disintegrated due to short-termism, the code of life being used for malevolence like biowarfare, and then the artificial general intelligence being unaligned with the most benevolent outcomes. So what I mean by winning is I mean becoming mimetic gods, communicating, compressing, distilling art that awakens so that we win, as in we get to the Godhead, the gateway, which again I hypothesize as the metaverse, and then we go inward, transcension hypothesis, John Smart, into the next big bangs, into the next consciousness exploring infinity. Okay, just to get back to this, I just want to show another thing here, because we made this analogy, which is great. So what was occurring was that we had talked about this one as the subject's relationship usually with the, let's put it up here, with the these will be our another. It's like it's funny. It's like an analogy in an analogy. Actually, I've never thought of that before. Or I think I have thought of that before in some ways. But okay, so now we're using an analogy within an analogy. Okay, I don't know if you guys can see that well, but okay. So I wrote the word phone, right? Because it's usually what happens is we get our phone. We get immersed in the phone,
yep.
right? Okay,
that's right.
So what's occurring in this one is the subject becomes aware of its relationship with the phone.
As in, I'm addicted to my phone.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is where we write the words.
And perhaps that's almost a psychological self-awareness in a way, right?
Okay. Yeah. Well,
because it's a very tangible version of self-awareness. It's not.
Yes.
It has no relationship to spirituality per se. But continue.
Yeah, there's more to it, but they're not mutually exclusive things. But yeah, social dilemma is what we wrote there.
Right.
Okay, so we have the subjects fully engrossed in the phone and spending a vast majority of their time only aware of the tip of the iceberg, which is the phone, their relationship with just objects. And then in this case, when you get a little bit deeper, you kind of start getting towards like maybe the water line of the iceberg, and you start getting a little deeper because the subject becomes aware of its relationship with the object. In this case, it would be like what social dilemma catalyzed for people's awareness.
That's right.
Excuse me. So what I believe Tristan Harris said was that Netflix gave some sort of statistics of somewhere around, it's in the tens of millions of people have watched, and which is pretty awesome that there have been that many people that have watched. Now, if it's true that people have watched with their families at the same time, like if 5 people watched at once and Netflix only got the statistic that one person watched because it was one account.
Good point.
So it might be somewhere beyond 50 million people have seen. Okay, so this is the approximate. Now, what that's doing is it's slowly waking people up to their relationship with object, which is really interesting. Okay, so now we have that. Now, I would like to go another layer.
So is it okay if we pause on this for a moment? Because I think what's interesting about this as well is there's the relationship between, there's the individual understanding how they're relating to the object, and that's the perceptive way, and then there's the people that institute that dynamic, right? As in, and to me, that's kind of where you start to get into the territory of 48 laws of power type thing. Yeah. There's people that are deploying those techniques intentionally, assuming that, with the assumption that most folks are operating in zone 1. So they're never going to bridge into zone 2 and become aware of that thing. They're betting on the lack of that happening, right? The low probability that it will happen. But this has happened on a mass scale, right? It's almost, in a way, it's a mass awakening and awareness about the potentials of psychological manipulation, frankly, right?
Yeah.
And they're the same forces and pressures that we've seen throughout history, the kind of Machiavellian forces, right?
I want to also say that as you bring this up, it's important to remember that the classic example of the knife being used to cut vegetables in your kitchen or being used to stab and kill somebody. So in the case, it always the double-edged. And so in this case,
I agree
in this case, it's really interesting because what you can see is that the peak of the Fortune 500 companies that have created the subject's relationship to objects to be very, especially hyper intimate and information technology driven, especially in the last couple of decades, is the same companies that have, in a sense, enabled the social dilemma to have occurred.
It's bizarre in that sense.
It's so bizarre in this sense. Yeah. So it's super interesting. Okay. So, and that's, again, I write about this in High Level Perception in chapter 2, seed theory, in the second graphic on trajectory mechanics, when I compare Newton's laws of motion to the evolution of consciousness. What Sri Aurobindo and the Mother Mira Alfasa taught me before anybody else was that the spiritual ascent and descent happen simultaneously. And people like Carl Jung and Jordan Peterson have also been very adamant about teaching said things, like Jung saying that the roots must reach down to hell in order for the flowers, the branches, the leaves to reach heaven. And so in this case, it would be that the ascent and descent are happening at the same time, meaning that the same way that people are becoming hyper addicted to their object of their smartphone and their technology, is the same way that people are is the same. So that's the descent. Is the ascent is happening, which is that people are waking up to their relationship with objects, and that they should focus on their relationship, their subject's relationship with the object, because it is very important to realize what, if you're not aware and conscious of that, what it can do to potentially harm, and how you can actually augment your awareness by doing so. So the ascent and descent happen simultaneously.
I think that has a direct relationship to that idea that Jordan Peterson describes about, I think in his psychological classes, he would always, one of the exercises was to imagine that you were a Nazi prison guard. Yeah, exactly. Yep. And this idea that the only way to, frankly...
Did you notice I put that in the Epstein documentary? I put that at the very end of the Epstein documentary, because a lot of people... and it's funny because there were a lot of, out of the tens of thousands of comments, a bunch of them,
the moral high ground, right?
A lot of people were getting onto some moral high ground. They were thinking that I was making some claim about Jewish people, or I was making some claim about German people, or I was making some claim about Hitler, or I was making some claim about, I was making no sort of claims about, I was only trying to communicate to people the same way that Jordan taught me, that you should always get behind the eyes of the perpetrators and realize that you yourself
may in fact actually would have been them.
Would have been
quite
them.
Likely.
Exactly. Quite likely would have been them. It was the same way that people could have easily become Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell.
That's right, if they were put in those same circumstances.
Or the women that decided to funnel themselves into those scenarios. Or the men that perpetrated.
That's right.
As well.
All the players, all the cast of characters.
So it's so interesting watching people take moral high ground when in reality, their money is very interestingly, I said this at the beginning of the Epstein documentary, is almost always a function that makes people ethically succumb to money.
That's right.
And so this is what is very important, is to work on oneself to such a degree, including myself and including everybody, that work on your moral and ethical and spiritual essence to the point where money cannot pervert those fundamental essences of you. Yeah. So
and I think
I'm happy you brought that up.
And it speaks to what you were saying, that there's a simultaneous ascension and descension in order to achieve this middle relationship awareness. And I think that has an analog to this idea that you have to descend into almost imagining the scenario in which you are converted to a perpetrator, Nazi prison guard, right? In order to realize that you have to go down that depth to be even aware of it. You have to imagine the scenario and imagine the truth and see the truth that you probably, would not have been the moral high ground. But only at that point, once you've kind of traveled down that road and sawn yourself naked enough that you could say that there is a part of me inside that would be capable of these terrible things. Yes. That is kind of that. Yes. I am capable of being addicted to my phone. Yeah. It's admitting it is the first step, right?
Yep.
And then only from there can you begin to mitigate against it. You know?
Yep.
So
that's right. Yeah. We're so spot on.
Yeah.
So in that graphic that I showed from chapter 9 of the integral from 0 to 8 billion of all the nerve endings and of consciousness, that you can imagine that some of the nerve endings of consciousness have been the perpetrators at the Nazi prison camps, as well as the people involved in the Epstein scandal.
That's
the more that you realize that we're taking an integral, we're keeping a holistic perspective on everything from the source point, which is hypothesized today to be a Big Bang, up until the 8 billion people alive on the planet at the same time, which took 100 billion people and 100 million species up until this point. There are 10 million species on the planet-ish, so what we think right now. That you have to take the integral of all of that, including what we just mentioned with Nazi prison camp guards and people involved in the Epstein scandal, as all one holistic unity. And once you begin doing that, Now you're beginning to get into some transpersonal and some non-dual states of consciousness and in symphonic states of consciousness. So we will hopefully be able to get there as well. So this, I would say, is the sort of slow introduction to what may be the nature of consciousness, the nature of reality, if you will. So let's continue. We will go into, we had in the icebergs below water section, we were also talking about the subject investigating itself and the subject investigating other subjects, and the subject investigating the whole. So we can say probably the subject investigating other subjects, and then the subject investigating itself, and then the subject
investigating its relationship with itself.
Yeah.
Yes.
So here we have the subject investigating subjects, which is technically investigating itself, but if you will, play with the nerve ending investigating the nerve ending, or the cell investigating the cell of the organism. Just play with me. And then we have the self investigating itself. And remember the Delphic maxim, know thyself, right? So we're slowly working our way. And then there's the self investigating the whole, which is probably best described by the graphic that I made for chapter number 8, which is called the magic trick for high level perception. Would you type? Yeah. Sorry, guys. I wasn't able to get my NDI connection working with my laptop, so we're just using Evan's for this. Let me put that on the center cam, just so I can. I just want to really finish this point quick, because I think it'll be insightful. Okay.
Yeah.
So if we go,
do you want me to chime in, or do you want to?
Yeah, I just want to hit this really quick. So
I have some thoughts.
Great. Okay, excellent. So, all right. So here's your classical graphic for. Oh, interesting. So, we actually are getting a small issue where I can't show the. Let's see. I see. So can I wonder if it's. Oh, it did activate. Okay, great. Sorry. Awesome. Thank you. Woo. Thank you, technology. All right. So I think that this graphic from Chapter 8, The Magic Trick, does a really good job at teaching us what it means for the subject to investigate the whole. Okay? So it's, I'm not going to be able to, I guess, draw the whole magic trick here, but maybe the best way for me to do that is to sort of give you a very low dimensional view of that, where it basically ends up being the humans that evolve on the planet finally begin to they begin to inquire into the magician, right? So it's something like, let me see if I can put this up again for you guys. Okay. So it's something like this. So the subject begins investigating the whole, which is the magician, that is our source, that then catalyzed a process where we birthed as conscious agents that could then contemplate our own source. So we could contemplate our whole. Okay? All right. So now, again, one more time, we have this. I also want to say the self investigating another self, a subject investigating another subject, is usually deemed in today's culture as empathy. This is usually the way that we kind of talk about it. And we can also, another sort of way to understand it is when a lot of people, for those that have been in love before, what usually occurs is, and this is not only like a person romantically falling in love with another person, and then whether it be for a year or 3 years, or whether it be for them getting married and having a kid, because what happens then is you fall in love with another subject, right? You fall in love with your kid. And so then there's that relationship to another subject that's very intimate and close that people experience. And then maybe that kid goes on to themselves also experience love. A lot of what people do is chase after experiences that make them feel closer to God.
Yep.
And so whether that be chasing, and Rupert Spira really taught this well. He was one of the leading non-dual teachers of the Advaita Vedanta direct path, that a lot of the time that our experience chasing of substances or a one-night stand or any of these sort of love in this case also can be this way, that is usually because we feel some sort of a lack. And so it's basically the self not knowing itself. So if the subject truly was self-aware, which is what we kind of talked about at the beginning, that you would have a true gnosis, right? A true knowledge, as the Greeks would say. You know yourself. And if you know yourself, then you know your source. You know the oneness. You know the relationship when you have a subject-to-subject relationship, that it is the subject in relationship with itself, the self in relationship with itself. And it's all on a spectrum of, like we said, individual to universal. So we can probably also add that to make it a little bit more also friendly, I think, that there's some sort of like a there's some sort of like an individual to universal spectrum that exists. And the whole point in my proposal about symphonic consciousness is to be able to do the two simultaneously. So basically, if you can merge if you can merge the individual and the universal and hold them both at the same time, that's when you attain symphonic. Now, what occurs is you have the hyper this is the most sort of this is the most common modern day analysis of this, is you kind of have the I'll actually use my
Eastern versus Western.
yeah,
one?
yeah, you're spot on. So we have the very classic sort of like USA, specifically, especially the US today in modern day, and then this could be something like we can probably write. I'd probably write India first, and then kind of like China, something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so, all right, so we have USA on the individual, and we have the universal with India, China. So it's not as like kind of like binary and stuff like this, but just for us to, in a sense, be able to unpack these things in ways that are hopefully relatable and helpful. So, and it's funny because if you guys remember the graphic, thank you.
By the way, have we got any comments going?
Oh yeah, let's go check. Yeah, totally. This has been so interesting. I hope for other people it has too. I will definitely just go look at that here. I just want to show this so I can finish the point, and then we will. So if you can, as we say in High Level Perception's 7th chapter called the sorting algorithm, if you can hold the individual and the collective at the same time, meaning if you can drain the bathwater, the dirty bathwater of individuality, and drain the dirty bathwater of collectivism, and if you can uplift the good, the baby out of the bathwater of individuality, and uplift the baby out of the bathwater, which is of collectivism, and then if you marry the two together and have them make a baby, what happens is you synthesize the best codes from each of them, and you archive the old codes from each of them. And so that's an interesting hypothesis that we'll unpack a little bit more once we look at the comments of the conversation. And so Evan and I have been feel free to comment. We've been sort of mentioning before we started that we were going to be looking at these. So we would love to hear from you. Let's see what you guys have been talking about. Interesting. So far, seems to be, it's great. Been on for a little over an hour. We thought it was just going to be an hour. We'll wrap soon. I'll do my best to kind of finish some of the key. I mean, it's a lot of.
Well, I think we should
there.
start. Yeah, I think we should start analyzing. We should move to the next analysis of this because I certainly have an abundance of things.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I think we've kind of. I've heard this full rehearsal before, and you've heard my reaction, so perhaps in some sense I could deliver that.
Yeah, and so we've had some interesting comments of not being able to force a plant to flower early, which is a very, it's a common spiritual phrase, is you can't actually pull the flower to make it grow faster type thing.
Yeah.
And so,
well, I think
someone was appreciating our points on Aurobindo. People have been talking about the Pareto distribution, things like that. So
yeah,
that's kind of what's going on the comment stream.
So one interesting, to riff off that idea of pulling the plant too early. So not to go too far Well, there's a part of me that wants to question the whole premise of this, and I think I've said this a few times in our conversations. To me, a lot of this sounds like the idea of how this is the steps in which one might initiate a utopia. But the question. Let's
just transition because I know that it's almost. Sorry, I just want to say that there's something about. There's like this archetype that occurs in people's psyche where they go, this guy's a utopian, everybody don't listen to him type thing. And I just want to say, rather than use the word utopia, let's use the word protopia. So if you look up what the definition of protopia is it simply means we are incrementally bettering. That's it. Incrementally better. No utopia, protopia.
Okay.
Incrementally better, because it's something that Evan's mentioned to me over the last 2 weeks or so.
True.
And I would just like to make sure that we don't wander down this utopia rabbit hole, rather stick with protopia, just incrementally bettering. That's it.
Yeah, so the thing I would say, if that's the case, then the thing I would say, how does this particular mapping of where we might go differ from what's already happening, irrespective of us stating or advocating for this model? If just progressive incremental improvement is already what we're aiming for, that seems to be what's happening either way, right?
Yeah,
and that's where right.
Yeah, so but also not quite. Although does seem to be what's happening, it is not quite that, in the sense that, okay, here's the core claim. If this is true, if it's true, it's probably the most paramount thing that I've learned that will affect our trajectory. If it's not true, then I want to know that it's not true. So I have a very high level of openness to learn from other people that this is not true. Okay. The idea, which I wrote again in chapter 10, Infinity, I wrote the 2 words Darwinian Metaphysics.
Yeah.
It basically means that the natural selection applies at the universal level. That's all it means. So what that means is that if it's true, so again, right? I'm not dogmatic. I am not fundamental. I am extremely open. I have extremely interesting abstract ideas, and I just want to know what the nature of reality is. That's all I care about.
Well,
and so,
I'm with you, brother.
I'll just finish. Exactly. So I'll just finish the point. So if it's true, because I think this is the thing that will change our civilizational trajectory from incremental betterment to holy fuck, this is extremely important. Okay? Those are 2 vastly different things. Okay, so I think
is it okay? I think we should definitely make this a dialogue. Personally,
yeah,
I think it's super important.
Yeah, okay,
because that's the point. Otherwise, you could.
Of course. So I just want to say, Darwinian metaphysics, if it's right, then people will realize that it's really important for us to undergo recursion, aka it's important for us to ethically, morally, and spiritually align ourselves with Christ, Buddha, Lao Tzu, Confucius level consciousness, and basically try our absolute best to maximize the flourishing of every single human seed to its fullest possible potential, and create a synthesis of artificial general intelligence, simulation theory, mixed realities, biotech, and neurotech fused together into the metaverse, which is where we're going, which is potentially where we came from. And so we can actually undergo recursion into the infinite designer realities that we create, which is potentially where we came from before the Big Bang. Now, if that's not true, if there is no Darwinian metaphysics, if it's guaranteed that we make it to the next recursion, it's guaranteed we make it to the Godhead. If that's true, then if it's just guaranteed, so if Darwinian metaphysics does not apply, I want to know that as soon as possible. I'm actively looking for it to figure it out. So,
well, I think to me, Darwinian would imply that this is a truth in the material true sense. And I think to circle back to where we very started with this conversation, consciousness being subjective storytelling, right? That's kind of where I come at this. It's not so much that one story is right or wrong. It's just I think it's how utilitarian and useful is the story. You see what I mean?
For sure.
Because in the same way, in some ways, what this kind of this world that you've painted and created through the relationships between these ideas and the architecting of it, to me, it does have shadows and echoes of a religious doctrine, right? And I would argue that it's almost birthed of that, right? I think in order to create this particular relationship set that you've set up, it's a distillation of many major world religions, right? So it synthesized.
And just to be clear, it's also a distillation of many cutting edge sciences. Just to be clear,
okay.
Because I mean, it's just very comfortable to sort of like slot like higher level thinking into kind of like. This is an archetypal synthesis of religion, and so this has a lot of religion essence to it. And so I just, here's the thing. You can't walk around to the somewhere around, let's say, 5 billion or 6 billion religious people on the planet, and you can't actually have a full dialectic with them on artificial general intelligence, blockchains and cryptocurrencies, biotech, neurotech, quantum mechanics, geopolitics, geoeconomics. I have very precisely and carefully become polymathic to the degree where I have synthesized the spiritualities and the sciences and businesses and arts and all of these things into a very carefully crafted project. Again,
but to me, that's subjective storytelling. Right? That's exactly
and
what
that
it is.
First thing that you said was fair.
Yeah.
The first thing you said was fair. I just didn't think that.
How do you apply Darwinian principles to something that's inherently subjective? Darwinian is a materialist argument, right? Like that, the material truth. In a materially true world, something will prevail. But in this kind of homogenous field of ideas where we're not applying a value judgment, because in my opinion, it's more about how effective is this meme of an archetypical story or an archetypical architecture.
Like you said,
perhaps this resonates with a certain percentage of population, but perhaps Christianity or some other doctrine that still puts, evolution of knowledge of goodness and moral virtue at its peak. Like what's to say that it's true in the sense that the relationships, it's relationally true, right? The relationships embedded in them in this are true in the sense that they're analogous to all these other relationships we see in other doctrines that we consider to have proven their value to when deployed appropriately and when deployed in a good faith sense lead to good moral results, is right.
So if we go one step above Darwinian metaphysics, what we arrive at is consciousness exploring infinity. Okay. Yeah. And if consciousness exploring infinity is true, what happens is Darwinian metaphysics is potentially even not that, it's not as important, because if the source point, if you imagine as we have in the infinity diagram, if this is true, again, I'm so deeply in love with being wrong that I have no problem at all of saying things that might possibly help people. But if they're wrong and people can show that, I'm extremely open. So, all right. If it's true that from this graphic in High Level Perception, Chapter 10, Infinity, the second graphic, if it's true that from that, this is Benoit Mandelbrot. In the background is Benoit Mandelbrot's Infinite Fractal Zoom. It's his Mandelbrot set, and it's Maths Town on YouTube is the channel that does a really good job of making these. What I would say is, if that's true, that from that center source point right there in the middle where the green square is, that, and then if you go to the top left corner where the green square is where the diamond is at the center of the prism that is refracting the source white light into all of its rainbow combinatorics, that if that's true, basically the idea is something like boom, 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 boom. That's how fast universes are being created. So if it's true, again, it's just a thought that if you look at the top middle, those would be like the universes that are being created. It's something like that. It would look something like the universe is being created super fast like that, and that if consciousness is exploring infinity and there's all of these different permutations and combinatorics of who you are, who I am, who Evan is, who different combinations of math and physics, different combinations of sentience being non-carbon based, non-DNA coded creatures, completely different universes that look kind of like what the top right corner looks like, where it's a little bit like worlds that are of your infinite imagination, like what maybe Pixar or Walt Disney would create. Things like that, that if that is all happening this fast, then Darwinian metaphysics doesn't apply as much, it's not as important, because even if this reality does not undergo the recursion, if it does not meet its godhead and go into the metaverse, if we completely obliterate ourselves with any of the Fermi filters, then what happens, if this is true, is potentially conscious agents go into the next births of exploration on other combinatorics that are being made. So that's the essence of potentially consciousness exploring infinity, even transcending Darwinian metaphysics, which is what many of the perennial spiritual philosophies have talked about. And last thing I would say about it is that it's always interesting to me hearing how often people like haven't studied the Old and New Testament, or they haven't studied Sufi metaphysics, or they haven't read the Tao Te Ching, or they haven't read the 4 books, 5 classics, or they haven't read the Upanishads and studied Advaita Vedanta and Dzogchen and Theravada Buddhism and danced the African Vodun tradition, or done entheogenic medicines of the Native Americans, or done sweat lodges, and how often people still somehow haven't done any of those dozen things, but how yet they have formed some sort of concrete opinion about perennial spirituality. So the reason why I say that is because I myself, if you guys remember, if anybody watched the interview I did with Jordan Peterson 2.5 years ago, what happened was I was 25 years old and I had only tried Theravada Buddhism, and I had tried some entheogenic plant medicines, and I had dabbled a little bit in some of the other major books of spirituality and whatnot, but not too much. So 2.5 years ago, my essence to Jordan Peterson was something more along the lines of, there's a lot of dirty bathwater. Man, that religion and spirituality stuff, there's a lot of dirty bathwater. Can't science just do everything? And it was funny.
Well, science is descriptive, not prescriptive, right? It's the most important thing to think about, right?
His reaction was very like, kind of like, basically like, kid, you're not doing the justice of the planetary perennial spiritual philosophies and wisdoms any justice, because you're 25 and you think you know, but you don't. Yeah. And so what I see is, I see a lot of 20-year-olds, a lot of 30-year-olds, a lot of 40-year-olds, a lot of people who I spent finally in the year 2020, I spent 10 straight months putting together a lot of high-level perception. And I don't want to just focus, obviously consciousness and infinity are important, but really, high-level perception's core is really at trying to analogize what the seed of a tree and the seed of a human are. And so the human seed needs nutrients in order for it to produce fruits. That's really like one of the main core first essences that I give in it. But that it's just so surprising that people that are just a couple decades old will basically throw away the 5,000-year-old planetary spiritualities because they think that it's just all dirty bathwater, and that I spent 2020 specifically trying to immerse myself in all of those dozen that I described to you, and it was a lot of work. I literally took 10 months to do. You know how few people can take 10 months of their lives to do something like that?
It's true.
Very, very few people even take.
Well, that's something I wanted
week,
to bring up to you.
Take 1 week
earlier
to do that
as well.
Yeah,
Alan.
And so some people do that, and then they learn a lot, and then they try and bring that to other people.
Because I think there's there's a reason I brought up Maslow's hierarchy earlier too, because I think it definitely has a relationship to everything that you've sketched out.
Yeah.
Because I mean, there kind of has been evidence to show that as societies progress, there's almost an analogous relationship between the subject-object relationship and the ability to meet your basic needs, right? Like literally, you could just take that diagram and put it next to Maslow's hierarchy, and they would be one-to-one, you know. And the reality is, it's only kind of in nations wherein, or parts of the world wherein we have the luxury of not having to be stuck in S to O constantly, that we have the ability to transcend, right? Like and I think
800 million people we listed earlier that were undergoing tremendous
exactly.
stress.
It's
with
going to be
water.
tough for them to get to the top of Maslow's hierarchy or to your last option, because their brain space is literally filled with just the bottom of the pyramid, right?
And not always correct, because a lot of extremely wealthy people in modernity are extremely low in egoic consciousness. True. And a lot of very poor people living in international poverty, which is less than $2 per day, US dollars per day, are some of the most enlightened people, which is super interesting. So there's a lot of people that fit into a different, and I described that again in chapter 6 on AI Coach in the second graphic on the biometrics of awakening, that you have a wealth hierarchy next to a enlightenment hierarchy. But the funny thing is, you don't know. I agree with that. You don't know where the people are on the enlightenment hierarchy. Yeah. So Maslow's hierarchy is an important creative archetypal structure that gives us insight, like you're describing. It doesn't. I just want to be clear. It does not precisely articulate the. It's archetypal. Yeah, it's archetypal. It's one aspect.
The other thing,
not all of the nuance. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is, and you know, so Alan and I have talked enough that we know each other's curveballs and we know each other's lens that we're going to apply. And I always go psychology first. I lead with psychology. So the really important thing I would say is, if you know the Myers-Briggs personality test, which is very similar to the Big Five,
although it is
not exactly the same.
Although it says that the psychoanalysis of the Big Five has been proven to be more effective than the Myers-Briggs.
That's right. That's true.
That is a true statement. And I
statement.
just want to be clear, because you do talk about Myers-Briggs a lot, but you talk about Big Five a lot too. But I just want to be fair here, that it's good.
Let's be fair.
Okay. Yeah.
So that being said, there's this concept that, so within the Myers-Briggs, it's a 4-dimensional breakdown of, it's the first letters E and I. You're either more extroverted or more introverted. It's obviously a sliding scale. The second dimension is intuitive or sensing, sliding scale. And that one's a little bit less obvious what that means. People that are sensor driven are more naturally predisposed biochemically to be oriented towards the physical world. Intuitives are much more like Alan and I are probably the audience, that are more interested in ideas, right? In the intangible, in making predictions or projections about the nature of the world based off things that are not physical, right? They're not just straight observation. T or P, thinking or feeling. I think that one's relatively self-evident. And the last one, perceiving or judging. And the thing I think that's important to remember with all this is that there is literally all those relationships statistically in the general population are essentially 50-50. There's about half extrovert, half introvert, half thinking, half feeling, half perceiving, half judging. The one doozy is intuitive and sensing. There's way, way, way more sensors than there are intuitives. And if you think about that from a biological standpoint...
Was it 2/3, 1/3, or 3/4, 1/4? Or what do you mean by
way
more?
I believe it was 2/3 to 1/3.
Okay.
66% to 33%.
66 sensing... 30,
exactly. 66% of people are naturally predisposed to be more concerned, frankly, with S to O,
physical,
right?
Tactile, physicalism type thing, and then subjects immersed in object, and then intuitive would be something more like ideas, and maybe they would want to explore what the relationship of the subject is to the object, or the subject to itself via other subjects, or things like that.
Abstract thinking. And so the important thing to think about with that is, I mean, there's probably some pretty clear biological reasons why that would be. I mean, intuitives are going to be much more valuable and of utility in leadership roles. They're going to be of utility in teaching roles. But those things relative to the overall percentage of people operating and doing and working things in the world, like you need a lot more people historically that were actually physically doing things, that were obsessed with the physical world, moving things, building things, construction workers, fishermen, people that are bakers, people that are very in the physical. I mean, if we had that, if you actually think about it historically in the way we used to operate, or still kind of do, if that ratio was much more like 50-50, we kind of be in trouble, because we'd have all these people that want to talk philosophy all day when we're trying to, make sure we have enough food to survive, right? Or enough like wood chopped to, keep the fire going. So that would be the lens and the overlay I would lay on top of this, is that it's important not to forget that there literally are a larger percentage of the population that's predisposed to not think this way, nor have a temperamental interest in thinking abstractly.
So are you essentially saying something along the lines of that, that over the course of the last 6 or so million years of evolution from the chimpanzee to the human, that it somehow ended up that, especially maybe in the last couple 100,000 years or so, that the 50-50 splits across the other Myers-Briggs sections besides the sensing versus intuitive are 50-50, because that's evolutionarily okay for our trajectory. But the one
that's the assumption, yeah,
that is not okay to be evolutionarily 50-50 is sensing intuitive, because in order for from about a couple 100,000 years ago up until maybe 10,000 years ago and whatnot, to have kind of gotten there, we required more people to be sensing so that they could to be in the physicalism,
to be operating primarily in the physical,
physicalism,
child rearing, child reproduction,
okay,
procuring food.
I'll say that I'll give you like that. That was an interesting. I like that point.
And let me give you. And I actually got something that might fall into your camp. But you could probably make a pretty compelling case that as we're becoming on a population level, at least in the West, there's less need for hands-on kind of work.
Do you remember
and
what
we're needing more synthetic work?
Do you remember what I wrote?
You could make the case that intuitives will cycle up in the population as a percentage. You could make that case. I could see that happening.
Super interesting.
Because we'll be the genetically successful people.
In 2018, I wrote on my personal website, alansakian.com. In 2018, I wrote the phrase, "We're not farming, we're on Twitter." Period.
You couldn't have put it more concisely. That's exactly
that's the whole mimetic gods thing we were talking about.
That's exactly. That's
if you could just put it into
really
a sentence, like,
potent.
So that I think you're right that it might be true that maybe in the next, okay, I'll get a little bit woo in a sense, because what happens is you have people that try and analogize like an octave to the evolution of consciousness from the Big Bang until the Godhead Ouroboros. And so what they say is that we are approximately in the third density, okay, and that we're evolving to the fourth density and beyond. And what would be said is that in the third density, there is a lot of egoic consciousness. There is a lot of the subject immersed on just the physicalism object, and that may be more on the Myers-Briggs in terms of sensing, and that where we're going into the fourth density is more something along the lines, which would be, again, it would be something like the E to the F, like C, D, E, F, G, A, B, right, in the octave.
Yeah.
That from the E to the F, what you would see is something like people evolving from a self-dealing service to self-egoic consciousness, focus on the subject's focus on the object immersed in it, to something that's more like service to other, something that's more like love, wisdom, light, an investigation into the relationship, an investigation into the self, an investigation in those things. And then if that's true, if you're right, what could be true is that over time, if we could, like, again, I tried doing this in AI Coach in chapter 6, in basically the data visualization, because we could technically do what you're talking about if we would actually just more if we kind of just really here, look at this. If we gave a little bit more of a fuck about, Edward Tufte's quote, above all else, show the data, right? That's the quote on the top of Chapter 6 AI Coach here. And if we could visualize not only the individual's data like this, but I mentioned how this is scale invariant, meaning it applies not only at the individual level, but you could visualize kind of like your family's data. You could visualize your city's data, which is something that Bloomberg and the cities initiatives are doing with smart cities. They want to visualize their data so you can understand what how the economy is doing, what the response time is of the fire department and of the police department, and how the pool occupancy is doing and stuff like that. So people, people care about data visualization. And so if you scale invariant, so if you take it beyond the level of city, you get to like the state or the country. So imagine if the country had like an operating system of its data visualization and it could see what was happening. Because right now, all you have is you have someone that occasionally says the United States is $28 trillion in debt. And then other people go, okay. And then they go back to kind of like their day-to-day shit. But like if you actually sort of had like the United States is like approximately $4 to $5 trillion like yearly budget, and like where a quarter goes to the military industrial complex, or a fifth goes to that, a fifth goes to Medicare, Medicaid, a fifth more goes to those, and then the little $60 billion that gets sprinkled into education. Meanwhile, the military industrial complex is $700 billion plus. So if people could visualize things like this, it would help awaken them. And we talked about this with data interoperability in our previous conversation. But then you go up to the planetary level of data visualization. So imagine if you had one of these dashboards for the planetary health, for the planetary. What you could do potentially is you could see the 8 billion humans psychometrics in a Myers-Briggs sense.
That would be interesting. And where those deviations occur over time.
And then you could see if potentially this idea of evolving from the third to fourth density, from a service to self to a service to other, is potentially actually catalyzing more and more people to go from sensing to intuitive.
Yeah.
And that's what I was getting at.
I believe that probably inevitably will happen, because we are building a world and certainly an economy that trades so much more on abstract thinking than it does on tangible thinking, for sure, right? I mean, tech and software, that's all abstract reasoning, right? It's not. I mean, there's a tangibleness to it, but I mean, creative strategy within those organizations, it's all about synthesizing a bunch of things, abstractly synthesizing metrics within the company itself, and then spitting out some sort of answer. And that can't be done. It's too abstract to be done in a sensing fashion, right? It's not just tabulation. It's analysis and synthetic conclusions.
Yeah,
that was really abstract. That was really abstract too. But
we're totally heading.
Let me put it this way: it would be hard to be Jack Dorsey and be a censor. Like I guarantee, I would. It would be hard
to be any Fortune 500 CEO.
There, exactly, because you have to be such a synthesizer of information to be that in that role. And I think you could also make a case that we're moving towards a world where, we're all kind of entrepreneurs, or we're all kind of leading our organization, or you know what I mean? Like, if we all are thinking synthetically, we all kind of are CEOs. Like, and that kind of honestly,
inclusive stakeholding.
There it is,
right?
Exactly. And that kind of is that. And I've thought about this before. That there's an odd to also speak to your circle analogy. There's an odd. Hopefully that's not too far.
You're good.
There's an odd recursiveness to that too, because if you actually look back to, and then I'll admit I'm going a little bit outside my realm of expertise, but my understanding, at least in kind of a layman's sense of like how medieval economies operated, it was always this like the metal, the metal smelter had a shop, right? And it was a one-person shop that was above his home. And everybody was kind of like a little shopkeeper, right? And they would live below, or they would have the shop at the base at the street level, and they would live in an apartment above. And there's this weird, bizarre, actual analogy of that. We're kind of going back to that, right? Like where everybody has their house, and then their computer is the business below the house, right? And it's all kind of compressed.
That's
and
pretty interesting.
it's instead of we corporatized and we expanded and got massive. Like that's what happened over the last well, not even 100 years,
which provided
frankly.
a lot of interesting things too. Yeah.
I mean, and there's upside, but I mean,
That
but
was
now
a
we're
cool metaphor.
shrinking, right?
I like that analogy. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is why I really like doing tennis with Evan, because he's always introducing me to things like Keith Tatlinger,
Yeah.
and people like these analogies that are even though and how that triggered the data interoperability thing, and then how this right now is triggering a lot of very very interesting things, because in a sense that is inclusive stakeholding, the idea that maybe you can set up a building where you can live on the top and you can have your shop below, and it can be in such city centers where there's maybe only just 1,000 or 10,000 or something people that live, and it's just this kind of local cluster of people that need bread, and that need water from aqueducts, and that need blacksmiths, and that need leather and shoes, and that need kind of just basic needs and materials, carpenters, things like that. And then what's kind of interesting is that if that idea can sort of like interconnect with the modern day laptop entrepreneur, I think that's a
decentralization.
Decentralization. So is it possible that we kind of this could be interesting. Did we possibly move our trajectory more from the sort of inclusive stakeholding, more like everybody was, in a sense, more like an entrepreneur? Sometimes there would be people that needed to run the shops that were just paid a nickel or whatever an hour, but that did we potentially have more of that? And then as a percentage of population, let's say, as a percentage of people per capita, these are always such interesting things that we don't have like the archaeological data of, that I would really love for us to run a simulation.
Yeah, we'll have to pull this up sometime. I mean,
we would need I think in order to get a lot of this archaeological data, we need a simulation of a civilization, and that that would give us the insights that we're asking for. So things like if it's true that back in the day of what we're describing, that it was that more people as a percentage of population were actually inclusively stake-held as an entrepreneur that lived above the business, and most people were like that, and then they bartered and interchanged and stuff like that. Versus in modernity, what we have is we have like kind of a handful of Fortune 500 companies that in a sense kind of globalized, and that kind of govern, in a sense, 8 billion people and the economies. Then it might be true that today, as a percentage per capita, it might be true that we are less inclusively stake-held than we were before, that we are less entrepreneurial potentially than we were before. As a percentage of population, maybe. But also, it's interesting, that's a cool analogy, and it might be also true that given our like biomimicry of what we wrote about in Chapter 5, inclusive stakeholding, that it might be true that we may be heading more towards like how mycorrhizal networks work in a two-way resource exchange underground, where we actually feed more and more of the mother trees, these big Fortune 500 trees, that they feed more of the sugars that they make from photosynthesis to the smaller seedlings in the understory, aka the vast majority of the 8 billion humans, that then enable them to sort of meet those basic needs in their roots in order for them to blossom their fruits. And so it might be true that later on, we might have, in maybe a decade or two, once we get these architectures fully in place and whatnot, that we might have a greater percentage of the population per capita actually entrepreneurial.
Oh, I think it's unquestionable. I think it's inevitable,
so
to be honest.
Interesting,
definitely. When it also depends on how you define, I think the classical separation between entrepreneur and corporate employee is also changing too, because think of something like, I mean, you could use the word gig economy, but I don't think So I think a good example of this is a company like Fiverr, right? That's essentially just a platform that enables individual,
But they're
creative.
not inclusively stake held. That's one thing. So
Yeah,
what's
maybe
occurring?
I'm in the details.
What's occurring with Uber and Fiverr and Lyft?
Uber, I'm reluctant to say.
I'll just quickly
that's a model. I don't
because
think it's
here's
a good model. Go ahead.
Here's what's happening. If you just go one more level up, what happened was the idea of a venture capitalist investing into an entrepreneur in the capitalist law and social fabric of the United States is extremely good because it's the most entrepreneurial place on the planet because of the code of law, and we need to appreciate that, everyone, seriously, and share that style of code of law with the world. But the next augmentation to that code of law is when a venture capitalist invests into an entrepreneur that has a team, and you have the founder equity that has maybe like 10% or so each. The venture capitalist gets somewhere around a couple percentage points themselves for making the investments. And then what happens is this sort of pool of, let's say, whatever, if it's 1 billion shares or 1 billion tokens, what happens is you have a pool of maybe 500 million shares or 500 million tokens. And what you do is you begin doing things like the Uber drivers or the Lyft drivers or the Fiverr employees, some degree of equity. So it's one level, the Silicon Valley really had those vested shares of common stock for the employees, which was really important to go beyond the founders to the employee level, which is good. But you can go next level of inclusive stakeholding, which is where like drivers for Uber and Lyft would get tokens or shares based on how much equity they're actually building for Uber and Lyft. Because if you think about it, out of the $100 billion evaluation, and same thing with the riders actually too, is that out of the $100 billion valuation, let's say that if whoever is a 10% or 5% stakeholder of Uber, they've taken a big risk, and they may be worth at 5% would be worth somewhere around $5 billion. And so out of the $5 billion, if the proposal was, how about instead of you having $5 billion of equity, what if you had $4.5 billion of equity, and the other $500 million of equity was distributed across the drivers and the passengers that actually made you able to have $4.5 billion? And then
that's interesting.
That's when everything clicks more for people usually, because they took that big risk. They deserve a big reward, a big payoff. But it's just, instead of getting a ridiculous amount, it's like you get in a ridiculous amount and a little bit less so that everybody can be more well off.
I definitely believe in that.
Yeah.
The passengers, that's interesting. Break that down a little bit more. How? Because I mean, you're essentially paying your customers.
Well, the idea is that the wealth creation engine itself is literally the reason why it happens is you have the Rube Goldberg moment of the entrepreneurs, the founders that then get invested by the venture capitalists. So these are the people that take the most risk. And then the next people that take the most risk are the employees, the employees that build the software and the technology that enable people to just use their phone in their car to become a driver and get paid. So those are the people that take the most risk. They deserve the most payout. Yeah. The next people that deserve the most payout are the people that in 2012 were the first ones that decided to work for Uber. Or not in terms of employees, but in terms of drivers and riders. Yeah, drivers and riders. So what happens is you have basically a titrated scale from 2012 to 2021. Look, by the way, this is the same thing we're describing with Bitcoin. It's the same thing. As in literally in 2008, people who came on board early onto Bitcoin are the ones that got the most disproportionate payoff. They own the most equity. And people that are trying to get into Bitcoin and other crypto in 2020 or 2021 are getting less of a payout. But by the way, you should still get into cryptocurrency, because in 10 years, you're going to be like, fuck, I should have gotten into crypto in 2021.
Perhaps so.
Because it's going that way. And so, again, it's just a simple idea is that people in 2012 that were driving and riding on Uber, they should get a slightly disproportionate amount of shareholders, tokens, or shares compared to people that are driving and riding on Uber in 2020. But then there's another sort of little asterisk, which is if somebody only let's say somebody only gave 500 Uber rides in 2012, but somebody in 2020 is giving 20,000 Uber rides to people, they deserve more in 2020, 2021, 2022. He's giving 20,000 Uber rides. That then it makes sense to actually also distribute potentially slightly more equity again to that person. So, but I just want to say one thing.
One more thing?
Not just one.
No, you got at least 10 more things, right?
I have a million things. But rather than spending, because this is interesting, I love talking about inclusive stakeholding.
Okay, well, let's stop. I got one more thing. I got one more thing for you.
Okay.
No.
Because I just want to revisit consciousness before we end. That's all I want to say. That's because we literally just every time.
I think it was
happens,
very clear, and there's never a conclusion, right? That's kind of the point of that conversation.
As Leonardo da Vinci says, art is never finished; it's only abandoned.
So I got one thing for you though.
Yeah.
So you got me on the Uber thing up until we pay the customer, because what I don't understand about that is the fact that the whole purpose of a company is to provide enough value in the market that people will take the risk to purchase the thing, even if it's new. If Uber would have never got their first customer, they would never be what they are now, right? But that person had to take that leap of faith and that risk.
You know how you pay $20?
I'm going to give you $5.
Exactly. You know how you pay $20 for the ride, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you pay $20 for the ride. You're generating Uber a slow, at that time, maybe only worth 25 million in 2012 or whatever the number was. And so you're paying in $20, then you're paying $20 the next week when you take an Uber, $20 the next week when you take an Uber. Before you know it, here's my point. After 8 years from 2012 to 2020, you've potentially paid $50,000 to Uber.
Yeah.
Maybe. Okay, let's just play with this example. If you've paid $50,000 to Uber from 2012 to 2020, my pitch would be something along the lines of this, that your $50,000 that you've paid into Uber has actually helped create Uber's valuation of $100 billion. So my question would be, what small, tiny percentage of shares and tokens of Uber's $100 billion valuation did you catalyze? That would be my only question. And then my following question would be, what kind of architectures do we need to have in place where that person we can very clearly visualize the data that tells us that for 8 years you paid in 50 grand, which Uber has. By the way, it's so funny. Uber has all this data. It's just not visualized. So as in literally Uber knows how many rides you've taken, where you've taken the rides, how many drivers they have, how many rides those drivers have done for them, how much wealth every driver and every passenger has created for them. Uber has all of that data for a billion people around.
But here's the thing.
planet.
Here's where I kind of maybe diverge with the Silicon Valley venture capital view of business, is that, remember, Uber's never made a profit. So their valuation in some sense is a theoretical abstraction, right? And especially, I remember the pool of money that a business has to deploy and increase the value of their tokens would be based off their profitability, right? If they're an unprofitable business, you can make the case that unless people are hedging their bets and driving up the cost of the tokens artificially, there's actually no real value creation, right? Until the customer is paying them enough that the company can become profitable, they actually haven't created value yet, right?
Well, they've created value.
I would call what they're doing, they're a hobby right now. It's value. Similar to what Adam Newman...
They just don't have cash flow. That's what...
They literally do not have... they've never made a dime. They're literally... It's like an engine that you keep feeding more fuel and fire, but it's never, it's a foundry you keep pouring into, but it's never made a forged tool. Nothing has been spit out yet.
Which is the service that they provide to the planet. But
and I know what their business model. Their goal is to addict people to the service. Their goal is to addict people to the service so that when they get autonomous vehicles and when they can't, and that's the only way Uber is going to become profitable. We all know that.
Well, not
is when they remove the drivers,
but
right?
the main, which
is the bizarre catch-22. But
yeah. So,
I mean, it's similar to WeWork and Adam Newman. I mean, they were funded by SoftBank, and they never made a dime. And to me, I don't call that a business. I call that a hobby, right? I call that a really expensive hobby founded by some very generous investors. And that's so I don't know how you pay your customers, because that's actually supposed to be the opposite. They're supposed to be creating the pot of money you use to value your business, to prove profitability, to prove that you brought value to the market, and thus the stock should be based on the actual value, tangible value you're creating, not like a theoretical value.
Yeah.
I mean, how does a business make profit if you?
I agree. Great nuance.
But this is economics. I mean,
this is great nuance. I like the points a lot on that riff. That's super solid.
You had me everything up until paying the. I actually agree. Equity should be driver. I think that's a great idea, and I think it's a way better idea than doing a guaranteed minimum wage for the drivers. I think having equity makes way more sense.
Yeah, correct. The universal basic income needs to be universal basic stakeholding. So
there you go. I love that.
Yeah,
I think that's great.
All right. Just to give you guys, I guess, a small. Let's see if we can do a small wrap here for those that kind of wanted this a little bit more directly. I don't know if that's going to get you the shot that well. I'll try and get you guys this actually on this angle quick. What I want to do is just very quickly get you guys into that zone again where we kind of got to unpack consciousness, because usually, as you guys know, what happens is we spent probably a solid 75 minutes or so on consciousness and unpacking it in beautiful detail, but then which we had a beautiful 30 or 45 minute bit just now on a non-consciousness related subject. It's still related, of course. Everything's related to consciousness, inclusive stakeholding, and all these things we talked about. But consciousness is so, as we said, elusive, and it veils itself so much that it almost purposely wanders off into other explorations rather than itself. And so, just to, again, guys, the little bit, I'll just give you the little bit one as we wrap here on consciousness so that we have this. So again, the idea is that we have a subject to object relationship. And again, everything is under the iceberg analogy. Let's just start with that. Everything is under the iceberg analogy. Above water, you have about 10% of the iceberg. Below water, you have about 90% of the iceberg. And what we see is a lot of people that are spending a vast majority of their time with consciousness in this area, which is something along the lines of the subject investigating the object, but they're immersed in the object, and it's a good analogy to use the phone. In the social dilemma, this is our next analogy, is that the subject becomes aware of their relationship to the object. So people become aware of their relationship to their phone. So they begin kind of slowly, in a sense, understanding what is in the iceberg's below surface layers. And then the subjects begin investigating other subjects. That would be something along the lines of when Evan and I get to truly, this is like, we gave the example of empathy when you kind of immerse yourself in the shoes of another person and truly try and understand their soul, but also when you try and empathize with 800 million people that don't have access to clean water and try and catalyze solution to that. But also the subject investigating a subject is also like, if you please try this, we do this a lot in spiritual circles around the planet. The idea is that if you just stay completely silent and just look at another human in their eyes for 60 seconds, so don't laugh, don't talk, but just look at another human in their eyes for 60 seconds. Usually what occurs is you realize that it is the one consciousness experiencing itself. And so you're experiencing the one consciousness through someone else's perspective. You see right through that nice little pupil. You see the one right through their pupil, and they see the one right through your pupil. So that's a great experience for you to have for subject investigating subject. And then you have the subject investigating itself. So that's where we talk about know thyself. So what does it mean if I investigate my consciousness, if I investigate my awareness? If you go to the Theravada Buddhism, which is the most direct conservative teachings of the Buddha, or if you go to Dzogchen, which is another teaching of the Buddhist lineage, or Advaita Vedanta, which is a teaching of the lineage of Hinduism and the non-dual direct path tradition. So you can sort of have a myriad of these Zen, the Sufi mystic tradition. I already listed a lot of these. So you can see how the self can investigate its own consciousness and awareness. Know thyself, the Delphic maxim written on the Temple of Apollo. And then also the self, and this is very similar, the self can also investigate the whole. And right, what you have here is you have the magician that makes the source, that's like the Big Bang that makes the creation, which is us 8 billion that are trying to think, what is my source? So this is basically very similar. It's the self investigating itself and also the self investigating the whole, right? Holism. So that's what I would say that's what we would potentially say is this 90%. So these things here are kind of like the 90% bottom of the iceberg that is very rarely explored as consciousness. And then if you synthesize symphonically the individual in the USA with the individuation, with the universality, with the sort of what India and China, the collective, if what you do is you drain the bathwater from both of these and you uplift the baby and you synthesize them into one, you get this symphonic consciousness where you can basically hold the universal, the oneness, at the same time as you can be a gifted individual artist in the world. That's the essence of kind of where, it's always helpful that we had Evan, because he was able to help draw out a lot of this hopefully valuable insight around where consciousness can try and go beyond just its relationship to an object and its immersion in an object and never even thinking about anything below in the depths of the iceberg. So that's in essence what I guess some of the cool stuff we got to on consciousness and a bunch of other awesome stuff.
That's right.
By the way, it's so cool. This was only our first sit down on the theme of consciousness and the nature of reality together on the show.
Formally, yeah.
Formally.
There's been some back alley, back room, smoke-filled room conversations.
There's been a lot of epic convos. Yeah, and this is only the beginning in the sense of not only like Evan being able to come on the program more often so we can unpack this stuff, but also for us to sort of, Evan and I have been talking a lot about in the sense of kind of like what Joe Rogan achieved with sort of being able to bring on his closest friends, right? His people from his Sober October group and stuff like that. He brings a lot of his friends on and they sort of have this like vibe, and a lot of people like that. But what we want to do is we want to sort of upgrade that vibe to a vibe where we bring on Evan and others higher level thinkers and guests, where we can focus maybe 3, 4, 5 people all simultaneously, very slowly, surgically, and precisely on subjects like consciousness and metaphysics, and sort of try and unpack these wisdoms and also try and disseminate them as mimetic gods to the rest of the planet via animations, anthologies, documentaries. So we're looking for people to help us on an animation front. So if you're really good at animation and you want to get involved with some of the mimetic god visionary stuff that Simulation talks about, then ping me, simulationseries@gmail.com. The link's always in the bio to our email, so reach out for that. And then also another thing is, imagine this conversation we just had about consciousness and metaphysics. Imagine this conversation occurring with the most famous people in Los Angeles.
That's right.
So we need the connections. We're working on it ourselves right now, on getting connected to the highest level people here and basically having them unpack their thoughts about consciousness, their thoughts about the nature of reality. And in doing so, what's going to happen is you're going to have these influencers that basically not only themselves become more awakened, morally, spiritually, ethically, and then butterfly effect out to the world, but their millions of followers that watch them will watch them undergoing the process, and they themselves will also get butterfly affected to inquire into, what do they mean by these things? Maybe I should care more about them. So that's in a nutshell what happened and what will be happening here. So yeah, stay involved. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, fam. We love you. Thank you for tuning in. Evan.
Wow.
Fuck yeah.
All right, brother.
Yeah. So
I guess that's it.
Yeah.
Unless we want to talk about, there's one word on the end there, but I don't know if we want to talk about that.
Oh,
Perhaps
that could be a good.
We could. Maybe that's a weird,
wait,
interesting outro.
Why don't we?
It would be a complete flip.
We're I think we're totally done with this episode. What we should do
That's
though
right.
is we should make that its own theme for the next time
Perhaps
we sit
it
down
is,
together.
perhaps it
And
is.
we're gonna.
You guys
we're-
would never guess what this word
this
is.
word is, yeah,
You
yeah.
would
It has-
you would have
Yeah.
no
We're not even
relationship
gonna-
whatsoever to anything we spoke about in the last
It
hour.
has some. I was gonna say.
Well,
it has
in
some,
a very sophisticated way,
yeah,
if
yeah.
you analyze it on a deep level, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah.
No
Yeah.
obvious connection.
Exactly. No obvious connection. So you'll enjoy next time Evan and I sit down together, there will be a subject that will be super interestingly different than what we talked about.
I feel like it maybe perhaps has never been discussed on simulation.
It has,
you can tell me.
it has been discussed in small nuances
Okay.
along the way, but we've had some people come on the show specifically to talk about the subject. And I'll
Actually, I take that back.
tell
I
you-
think I can think of one.
Yeah, I'll tell
Yeah.
you about them later. But so anyway, we'll do that next time. That'll be a lot of fun. Super epic round together.
Wow.
Love you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And also check out the links in the bio below to the show. Again, Evan's links are going to be down there for you to follow him, link up with him. And check out the episode we just did with him on cannabis architecture if that excites you. That was our previous episode together. And the one before that we did last year in 2019 was called The Ethos of Architecture. So you can check that one out. And then support the artists, the entrepreneurs, the spiritual leaders, the people that are rocking your community. Support them and help them grow and flourish, and help us flourish as well. And let us know your thoughts in the comments. I mean, that's it, guys. We love you very much. Thank you for tuning in.
Wow.
That's it. Investigate consciousness. Investigate the nature of reality. Do it more often. Make that a priority and share that with others around the world. And hopefully it will accelerate us to a more fruitful future. There's some interesting stuff in there about, also we talked about Darwinian Metaphysics and consciousness exploring infinity, and we talked about a lot of interesting things. So
All of Alan's favorite subjects. Certainly. I think we hit most of them,
Evan
right?
hit a lot of interesting tennis balls back that made me. There was a profound moment at your house when I realized that I was being too hubristic, and that was very important for me to become more humble. And I credit your help with that, and potentially a little bit of cannabis may have been
That's right.
may have been insightful.
Well, I actually had one more item for your list. I think in the subject to object. I think there's in a psychological world there's another option. And I don't know where it falls hierarchically in terms of its value, but it's the subject investigating themselves psychologically in terms of
That
knowing
is-
temperamentally,
I-
knowing
yeah,
where you're.
Yeah.
Because an important
Yeah.
thing to understand is we all, at least in my understanding of psychology,
That fits into what is.
it's
the
kind of
subject
actually a
this
meta
is.
thing, right?
Yeah.
In the sense that there is a typology and a neurochemistry and a temperament that by itself, regardless of outside forces, will have an inbuilt interest in spiritual issues, right?
And just to be clear,
Or
the
intangible.
the subject,
all those things
this-
are kind of, there's a meta element.
the
to that,
subject, if you remember, the
Yeah.
subject investigating itself, like we discussed, was not only the subject investigating itself as a universal, but it was the subject investigating itself as an individual,
That's right.
which we included the things you just listed, which was not only your roots and your fruits
That's true.
and your DNA, who you are, and your moment-to-moment beingness. We
We should
talked
talk about that
yeah.
more next time.
Okay.
I think it's a very
Excellent.
operative.
We'll add that.
Yeah.
I mean, that was
Anyway.
we spent some time on
My
that.
gosh.
Okay, love you guys very much. Thank you for
Stay
tuning
well.
in.
Stay well.
Stay well. We love you. Execute. Build the future. The more beautiful future that our hearts know is possible, as Charles Eisenstein would say. We love you very much. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.
Are we still on? No.
Yep.
Yeah.